Sailors vanished. During a storm in 1973, 40 years later, divers found this in the wreck. 50 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's gloved hand brushed away decades of silt from a sealed metal compartment. And in that moment, she had no idea she was about to uncover the truth about her own father's disappearance. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. It was a crisp April morning when Sarah and her dive team descended toward the wreckage of the Marina Star, a fishing vessel that had vanished without a trace during the catastrophic nor'easter of November 1973. The water was cold, biting through her wetsuit as streams of sunlight pierced the murky depths. 52 years later, the ship rested in an underwater trench, preserved by frigid temperatures and layers of sediment that had kept it hidden from previous search attempts. Sarah was 58 now, a respected maritime archaeologist known throughout New England for her methodical approach and unwavering dedication to honoring those lost at sea. But this expedition was different. This wasn't just another historical dive. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had been aboard the Marina Star when it disappeared. She was 6 years old when he never came home. As her dive light swept across the ship's exterior, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The vessel was remarkably intact, too intact for a ship that supposedly sank in a violent storm. The hull showed minimal damage, no signs of being ripped apart by waves or smashed against rocks. This didn't match the official reports she'd read 1,000 times. Her team member, Jake Rodriguez, signaled toward the captain's quarters. The door hung partially open, swaying gently in the current. Sarah approached slowly, her breathing echoing in her ears through the regulator. Inside, furniture remained bolted to the floor, charts still pinned to the walls. And there, wedged beneath what had once been the captain's bunk, she saw it. A watertight metal box, its edges sealed with what looked like deliberate care. Her hands trembled as she worked it free. This wasn't standard equipment. Someone had prepared this box specifically to survive. To be found. Back on the research vessel, as late afternoon sun warmed the deck, Sarah carefully opened the container. Inside lay handwritten logbooks, their pages remarkably preserved. Photographs showing the crew laughing, working, living, and letters. Dozens of unopened letters addressed to families who never received them. But it was the first entry in the captain's log that made Sarah's blood run cold. November 10th, 1973. We've found something down there. Something that changes everything. If anyone finds this, know that we didn't choose to disappear. We were forced to make an impossible decision. What decision? What had they found? Sarah's hands found a photograph near the bottom of the stack. Her father stood beside a young crew member, both men smiling, holding a distinctive carved wooden compass. The same compass that had sat in a display case in her childhood home for 50 years. The one her grandmother always claimed was a family heirloom passed down through generations. But here was proof. It had been aboard the Marina Star. Her grandmother had lied. The question was, what else had she hidden? Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small cabin aboard the research vessel, the captain's logbook spread across her desk under a pool of lamplight. The handwriting was steady, methodical. Captain Richard Brennan had been known as a careful man, not given to exaggeration or wild theories, which made what she was reading all the more disturbing. The entries began normally enough. Weather reports, fishing coordinates, crew morale notes. Then, on November 8th, everything changed. Discovered unusual formation during deep net retrieval. Sonar shows massive cave system, completely uncharted. Against my better judgment, we're going to investigate. The men are excited. I'm uneasy. Sarah's fingers traced the words. A cave system, large enough to show on sonar, yet never documented on any maritime chart. She pulled up modern bathymetric maps on her laptop. The area where the Marina Star went down was marked as open ocean floor. No caves, no unusual formations. Either the technology in 1973 had picked up something that modern equipment somehow missed, or someone had deliberately removed that information from the records. The next entry made her heart race. November 9th. Sent divers down. What they found, I don't have words. It's not natural. Stone structures, carved symbols, evidence of habitation. Pre-colonial, perhaps earlier. This could rewrite everything we know about early exploration of this coast. But there's something else. Signs of more recent activity. Someone else has been here. Someone who doesn't want this found. Sarah leaned back, her mind spinning. Her father had been part of this discovery. He'd seen something extraordinary, something that people had tried to hide. She thought of him as she remembered him. Strong hands teaching her to tie sailing knots, patient voice explaining how to read the ocean's moods. He'd never mentioned anything about archaeological discoveries. But then again, he'd never come home to tell anyone. As dawn broke, Sarah brought the logbook to her senior researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a linguistics professor from Boston University who specialized in maritime terminology and historical dialects. Elena's eyes widened as she read. "Sarah, this is incredible. But look here." Elena pointed to a passage Sarah had skimmed over. He writes about markings consistent with Wabanaki tribal fishing practices, but then uses a phrase that doesn't quite fit. He says, sacred calculation site. That's not standard terminology for fishing grounds. What does it mean? It suggests this wasn't just a practical location. It was ceremonial, spiritual. If the captain was right, your father and that crew found an indigenous sacred site that had been lost for centuries, maybe deliberately hidden. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "You need to see this. Found something in the forward hold." 20 minutes later, Sarah was suiting up for another dive. The morning sun glinted off the water's surface as she descended once more into the cold darkness. Jake waited near the ship's forward section, his light illuminating a section of hull that had been carefully cut away from the inside. Someone aboard the Marina Star had created a hidden compartment. Inside, Sarah found more documents, charts marked with coordinates, photographs of underwater formations, and a letter in her father's handwriting, addressed to his mother, Sarah's grandmother. "Mama, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. What we found is bigger than us. Captain says we need insurance. He thinks someone's been following us. I'm scared, but I'm also excited. This could change everything. Tell Sarah I love her. Tell her I tried to come home." The letter was dated November 11th, 1973, 2 days before the Marina Star officially disappeared. Sarah's vision blurred with tears inside her mask. Her father had known. He'd known something terrible was coming, and he'd tried to warn them. But the warning never arrived. Why? What happened in those final 48 hours? Sarah spread the documents across the conference table in her hotel room, having temporarily moved the operation to shore. Rain drummed against the windows as she and Elena worked through the night, piecing together the captain's notes like a puzzle made of secrets and fear. The captain had been methodical, documenting everything. His charts showed the location of the cave system with precise coordinates, depth measurements, and detailed sketches of the entrance. But more intriguing were his observations about the tidal patterns. He'd noticed something the official maritime charts had missed: an unusual current that reversed direction every 6 hours, creating what he called a breathing pattern in the water. "This is sophisticated knowledge," Elena said, adjusting her reading glasses. Indigenous peoples had been observing these patterns for thousands of years. The captain recognized he'd stumbled onto something important. But it was the photographs that told the real story. Image after image showed the interior of the cave system, walls covered in carved symbols, stone formations that seemed too precise to be natural, and what appeared to be the remnants of offerings or ceremonial objects. In one photo, Sarah's father stood next to a carving, his face showing a mixture of wonder and concern. Elena's breath caught as she examined a close-up of one symbol. "I need to make some calls." 3 hours later, Sarah found herself on a video conference with Dr. James Whitehorse, a historian specializing in Wabanaki culture and coastal indigenous history. His face on the screen was grave as Elena showed him the photographs. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly. Sarah explained about the Marina Star, the discovery, her father. Dr. Whitehorse was silent for a long moment. "What you've found is a winter sacred site," he finally said. "My grandmother spoke of a place like this, but we thought it was legend. It was a location where our ancestors would perform ceremonies for safe fishing, for gratitude to the ocean, and for communication with the spirit world. But it was also something else. It was a shelter, a place of refuge during dangerous storms." "You mean people actually stayed there?" "For days, sometimes weeks during particularly bad winters. The caves were known to our people, passed down through oral tradition. But in the 1800s, when colonizers tried to force indigenous people off the coast, many of our sacred sites were deliberately destroyed or hidden to protect them from desecration." Sarah's mind raced. If the crew found this place before the storm, they would have had shelter, Dr. Whitehorse finished. Natural air pockets, protection from the elements. They could have survived. The implication hung in the air like a weight. The official story was that the Marina Star had been destroyed in the storm. All hands lost at sea. But if they'd found shelter, if they'd survived the initial disaster, then what really happened to them? Sarah returned to the captain's log, reading with new understanding. An entry from November 12th leaped out at her. "Received another warning today. Vessel approached us. No identification markers. They know what we found. Meeting with the men tonight. We've decided to document everything and hide the evidence aboard. If we disappear, at least the truth will remain." Elena, who were they afraid of? Her colleague pulled out another document from the hidden compartment. A newspaper clipping from 1973, yellowed and fragile. The headline read, "Commercial fishing interests clash with independent. Boats over coastal rights." The article detailed a bitter dispute between large fishing corporations and independent fishermen like those aboard the Marina Star. The corporations wanted exclusive access to prime fishing grounds. They had money, lawyers, and political connections. The independent fishermen had only their boats, their knowledge, and their desperation to survive. "What if the archaeological discovery was just part of it?" Sarah said slowly. "What if the crew had evidence of something else? Something that threatened powerful people?" She found another letter, this one tucked between pages of the logbook. It was from a man named Victor Castellanos, owner of Atlantic Coastal Fisheries, one of the largest commercial operations on the eastern seaboard. The letter was cordial but firm. "Captain Brennan, I trust we understand each other. The waters you're exploring have been earmarked for commercial development. I suggest you relocate your operations." The date on the letter was November 5, 1973, a week before the Marina Star disappeared. Sarah looked at Elena, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't just about finding a sacred site. They were being threatened. Someone wanted them gone. But who? And how far were they willing to go? The next morning, Sarah received a call that made her stomach drop. Marcus Reeves, the development company owner who had partially funded her expedition, wanted a meeting immediately. She'd known Reeves for 2 years, ever since he'd approached her with an offer she couldn't refuse, full funding for the Marina Star expedition in exchange for salvage, rights and first opportunity for any commercial development of discovered sites. At the time, Sarah had been desperate. Her university funding had dried up, and this was her only chance to search for answers about her father. She'd convinced herself that Reeves was just a businessman interested in maritime history. Now, sitting across from him in an upscale restaurant overlooking the harbor, she wasn't so sure. Reeves was in his mid-50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never hearing the word no. He smiled as the waiter poured wine, but his eyes were calculating. "Satu Twaidi, I've been hearing interesting things about your discoveries, he said, cutting into his steak. A cave system. Indigenous artifacts. Very exciting. Sarah kept her expression neutral. We're still in the preliminary assessment phase. Of course. But I want to be clear about our agreement, Sarah. Any sites discovered belong to the expedition, which means they belong to me as the primary financial backer. I've already been in touch with my legal team about development possibilities. Development? Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. These are potentially sacred indigenous sites. They need to be preserved, studied properly. And they will be. In a beautiful educational tourist center. Imagine it. Underwater viewing stations, guided tours, a maritime museum. We could bring thousands of visitors to this area. Jobs, revenue. Everyone wins. Everyone except the people whose ancestors had created those sacred spaces, Sarah thought. Everyone except her father and his crew, who had died trying to protect this place. I need more time, she said carefully. There are legal considerations, indigenous rights consultations, which my lawyers are handling. Reeves leaned forward, his smile fading. Sarah, I've invested a considerable amount of money in this project. I have investors of my own to answer to. We have a contract. After the meeting, Sarah sat in her truck in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel. She felt trapped. Without Reeves's funding, she couldn't continue the expedition. But if she let him turn a sacred site into a tourist attraction, she'd be betraying everything her father had tried to protect. Her phone rang. An unknown number. Dr. Mitchell? My name is Catherine Brennan. I'm Captain Richard Brennan's daughter. Sarah's heart skipped. How did you get my number? I've been following news about your expedition. I have something you need to see. My father left documents with my mother before he disappeared. She kept them hidden all these years, but she passed away last month. I think it's time the truth came out. They met at a coffee shop in a small coastal town 2 hours north. Catherine was in her 60s, with her father's same careful eyes. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were more letters, more photographs, and something that made Sarah's blood run cold. A legal document dated November 1973. It was a contract between Atlantic Coastal Fisheries, owned by Victor Castellanos, and a development company for exclusive coastal development rights pending clearance of current obstacles. The name of the development company made Sarah's hands shake. Reeves Maritime Holdings. Marcus Reeves had been involved from the beginning, and the obstacles that needed clearing were the independent fishermen, including the crew of the Marina Star. There's more, Catherine said quietly. She pulled out a photograph. It showed a younger Marcus Reeves shaking hands with Victor Castellanos, dated 1972. Written on the back in Captain Brennan's handwriting, "Follow the money." They're all connected. My father knew, Catherine continued. He knew Reeves was working with Castellanos. He'd been gathering evidence of illegal fishing practices, threats against independent operators, payoffs to government officials. The archaeological discovery was important, yes, but it was also the perfect excuse. If the crew disappeared while investigating a dangerous dive site, no one would question it too closely. Sarah felt like the world was tilting. You're saying the disappearance was planned. I'm saying my father believed his life was in danger, and 2 weeks later, he was gone. Sarah looked at the documents spread between them, evidence of a conspiracy that had been buried for 50 years. She thought of Marcus Reeves, smiling over his steak, talking about tourist centers and revenue. He wasn't just a businessman interested in salvage rights. He was part of the reason her father never came home. But if the crew had died in the storm, why did Reeves need to hide the evidence? Unless they hadn't died in the storm at all. Sarah returned to the expedition with new purpose. But now she had to be careful. Reeves couldn't know what she'd learned. She kept her team small, sharing the full truth only with Elena and Jake. The three of them worked quietly, methodically, building their case while continuing the official investigation. She needed to understand exactly what happened on November 13th, 1973, the night the Marina Star officially disappeared. Sarah contacted Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a maritime weather historian at MIT who specialized in reconstructing historical storm patterns. Dr. Thornton's office was cluttered with charts, satellite imagery, and thick binders of meteorological data. She listened to Sarah's story with growing interest, then pulled out a massive leather-bound volume. "So, the nor'easter of November 1973, she said, flipping pages. "Sorry, one of the most severe storms of that decade. Winds exceeded 80 miles per hour. Waves reached 40 feet. Visibility was near zero. 11 vessels reported damage. 3 were lost, including the Marina Star. According to the official record, yes. But here's something interesting." Dr. Thornton spread out a weather map on her desk. The storm moved in very quickly, but there was a pattern to it. The worst conditions hit between 8 p.m. and midnight. Then there was a relative lull between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. before the second wave came through. A lull? Not calm, but survivable if you knew what you were doing. Experienced sailors could have made it to shelter during that window. Sarah felt her heart race. If the Marina Star's crew knew about the cave system, they could have ridden out the initial storm aboard ship, then made a run for the caves during the lull. It would have been risky, incredibly dangerous, but possible. Sarah pulled out the captain's log, showing Dr. Thornton the entry from November 13th, the last entry. "Storm approaching. Crew is prepared. If we can make it to the formation, we have a chance. God willing, we'll weather this and see our families again." Dr. Thornton's expression grew somber. He knew. He had a plan. But they never came back. Why? That question haunted Sarah as she reviewed the official Coast Guard reports from 1973. The search had lasted 5 days before being called off due to continued bad weather. No wreckage had been found during those initial searches. The Marina Star only appeared on sonar decades later, after Sarah had secured funding for a targeted expedition to the area where her father's boat had last been seen. But something in the Coast Guard reports nagged at her. Multiple references to commercial vessels in the area reporting debris, but no actual confirmation of what kind of debris or where it came from. Sarah made a list of the commercial vessels mentioned and started tracking them down. 3 were defunct companies. 2 had been owned by subsidiary corporations that traced back to, Sarah wasn't surprised anymore, Atlantic Coastal Fisheries. She called Jake. "I need you to look at something." The commercial vessels that reported debris from the Marina Star. Were any of them near the cave system coordinates? Silence on the other end as Jake pulled up the data. Then, Sarah, they were nowhere near where the actual wreck was found. They were 20 miles east. Why would they report debris in the wrong location? Because they were creating a false trail, making it look like the boat sank in open water, far from the caves. But why? If the crew died in the storm, what difference does it make where people thought they sank? Sarah stared at the timeline she'd been building on her whiteboard. Storm hits at 8 p.m., lull from 2:05 a.m. Commercial vessels report debris by dawn. Official search focuses on the wrong area. "They didn't die in the storm," she said slowly. "At least not right away. They made it to the caves, just like the captain planned. Someone knew they survived, knew where they were, and wanted to make sure no one looked in the right place." Elena knocked on her door, her face pale. "Sarah, you need to see this. I found something in the logbook. Pages that were stuck together. When I carefully separated them, there was one more entry, written in different ink, shakier handwriting. It's dated November 15th, 2 days after the official disappearance. The entry was brief, written in her father's hand. "We made it to the shelter, all 7 of us alive. Storm still raging outside. Captain says we wait for calm, then signal for rescue. Radio damaged, but we have flares. We have food for 2 weeks if we're careful. We're going to make it home." Sarah's eyes burned with tears. Her father had survived. He'd made it to safety, believing rescue would come. But rescue never did, and Sarah was beginning to understand why. Someone had made sure of it. The letter arrived at Sarah's hotel on a gray Tuesday morning, forwarded through the university from a law office in Nova Scotia. The envelope was thick, the paper inside written in careful elderly handwriting. "Dear Dr. Mitchell," it began, "my name is Margaret Blackwood. I am 83 years old, and I have kept a secret for 50 years. I believe it is time to tell the truth." Sarah's hands trembled as she read. Margaret's father had been the lighthouse keeper at Point Mercy, a small station about 15 miles from where the Marina Star went down. Margaret herself had lived there as a young woman, helping her father maintain the light and keep watch over the treacherous coastal waters. "On the night of January 24th, 1974, the letter continued, I was doing the midnight watch while my father slept. It was cold, clear, the first calm night in weeks after a series of terrible storms. I was looking out over the water when I saw them. Lights, signal lights coming from the ocean, flashing in a specific pattern." Sarah stopped reading, her heart pounding. January 24th. More than 2 months after the Marina Star officially disappeared. The pattern was one my father had taught me, an old fisherman's code used for emergency communication between ships and shore. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. Then a series of flashes that spelled out what I thought was a name. Marina. Sarah had to put the letter down, her vision blurring. She walked to the window, looking out at the ocean, imagining her father in those caves, cold and desperate, watching for rescue that would never come. She forced herself to keep reading. I ran to wake my father, but by the time he got to the watch post, the lights had stopped. He told me I must have imagined it. No ship could be out there. The Marina Star had been lost months ago, but I knew what I had seen. I knew. Margaret had told the Coast Guard, but they'd dismissed her report. A young woman, alone at night, probably seeing reflections or distant boats. Nothing to investigate. Her father, not wanting to contradict the authorities, had asked her to let it go, but I couldn't. The next morning, I took my father's binoculars and scanned the waters where I'd seen the signals. I saw something. A disturbance in the water near the rocks, like something was breaking the surface. I thought it might be debris or seals, but now, reading about your cave discovery, I wonder if it was an entrance to those caves. The letter continued. That afternoon, another storm rolled in, a massive system that lasted 5 days. When it finally cleared, there was nothing. No signals, no disturbances in the water, just silence. I have lived my whole life wondering if those men were trying to reach us, if they were down there waiting for someone to see their signals, and no one came. Sarah called Margaret immediately. The old woman's voice was soft, worn by age and regret. "I should have done more," Margaret said. "I should have insisted. But I was young, and people didn't listen to young women back then, especially when we contradicted official reports. Margaret, you might have been the last person to know they were alive. This isn't your fault, but don't you see? 2 months, Dr. Mitchell. They survived for 2 months. What kind of hell was that? Waiting, hoping, sending signals that no one believed." After the call, Sarah sat in silence, processing this new timeline. Her father and the crew had made it to the caves in mid-November. They'd survived through December, through January. They'd had enough supplies, enough hope to keep signaling for rescue, even after 2 months of isolation. What kind of strength did that take? What kind of desperation? Jake burst into her room without knocking, his laptop in hand. "Sarah, I've been analyzing the cave system with advanced sonar. There's something you need to see." The images on his screen showed a complex network of chambers and tunnels, but one section made Sarah's breath catch. A deep chamber, larger than the others, with distinct angular shapes that weren't natural formations. "That's not rock," Jake said. "That's stored material. Containers, maybe equipment. And look at this. He zoomed in on another section. Metal framework. Someone built something in there. They created a long-term shelter, Sarah breathed. This wasn't just hiding during a storm. They were preparing to stay. For how long? Sarah thought about Margaret's testimony, the signals in January, the desperate hope that had kept 7 men alive in the darkness, in the cold, waiting for a rescue that never came. Until spring, she said quietly. They were waiting for spring when the weather would be calm enough to attempt an escape. But spring never came for them. Something had gone wrong, and Sarah was determined to find out what. Sarah knew she needed to speak with more families of the crew. If Margaret Blackwood had kept a secret for 50 years, maybe others had too. She compiled a list of the 7 men aboard the Marina Star and began tracking down their relatives. The sister of Anthony Russo, one of the crew members, lived in a retirement community outside Portland. Her name was Maria Russo Castellano, and when Sarah called, there was a long silence after she explained who she was. I wondered if anyone would ever come asking, Maria finally said. Can you come tomorrow? There's something I need to show you. Maria was 86, confined to a wheelchair but with sharp, bright eyes that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. Her apartment was small but carefully maintained, walls covered with family photographs. She gestured to a box on the table. My brother Anthony was 28 when he disappeared, Maria began. He was supposed to get married that Christmas. His fiancée never recovered. She died 10 years later, never married anyone else. But before he left on what would be his final voyage, Anthony gave me something. He made me promise not to open it unless something happened to him. She pushed the box toward Sarah. Inside was a tape recorder, old, from the 1970s, and several cassette tapes. He'd been recording conversations, Maria explained. Conversations he'd overheard between the captain and some men who came to the docks. Anthony was worried. He told me if anything happened, these tapes would explain why. Sarah's hands shook as she loaded the first tape into a borrowed cassette player. The audio was scratchy, recorded secretly based on the muffled quality and background noise. A man's voice, aggressive and threatening. Captain Brennan, you need to understand the situation. The waters you're fishing belong to Atlantic Coastal. We have the permits, the rights. You're trespassing. Captain Brennan's voice, calm but firm. Public waters are public waters. We have as much right to be here as you do. Do you? Because I have documents that say otherwise. And I have friends in the Coast Guard, friends in the Harbor Master's office. One complaint from me and you lose your license. On what grounds? A different voice now. Sarah recognized it from news footage she'd found. Victor Castellanos himself. We don't need grounds, Captain. We need compliance. You and your crew move your operations north, away from our development zones, or you'll find life very difficult. The tape crackled. Captain Brennan. And if we refuse? Then accidents happen. The ocean is a dangerous place. Boats sink. Men disappear. No one questions it. Just another tragedy in a dangerous profession. Sarah felt sick. This was a direct threat, recorded just weeks before the disappearance. Maria was crying quietly. I listened to these after Anthony was declared dead. I knew it wasn't an accident. But who would believe me? A young woman with tapes that could have been faked? Against powerful men like Castellanos? Did you tell anyone? I tried. I went to the police, to the Coast Guard. They said the tapes didn't prove anything. Said threats are common in business disputes. They basically told me to accept my brother's death and move on. Her voice hardened. So I kept the tapes. I've been waiting 50 years for someone to ask the right questions. Sarah spent the next 3 hours listening to all the recordings. They painted a clear picture. Atlantic Coastal Fisheries was systematically driving out independent fishermen through intimidation, sabotage, and threats. Captain Brennan had been gathering evidence, documenting everything. The archaeological discovery had been important, yes, but it was also leverage, proof that the area had historical significance that should prevent commercial development. On the final tape, dated November 10, 1973, Captain Brennan was speaking to someone on the radio. His wife, Sarah realized. Margaret, if you're listening to this, it means Anthony got the tapes to his sister like he promised. We found something important. An indigenous site, protected under federal law. This could stop Castellanos and Reeves for good. But I'm worried. They're watching us, following us. We're documenting everything and hiding it aboard ship. If something happens, the evidence will be there. Tell the families. Tell them we didn't just disappear. Tell them we fought. The tape ended with static. Sarah looked at Maria. Your brother was brave. They all were. Brave men who died because they stood up to corrupt businessmen, Maria said bitterly. And the men who killed them got away with it. Built empires, lived long, comfortable lives, while my brother rotted at the bottom of the ocean. But Sarah was thinking about something else. The timeline was becoming clearer. The crew had evidence that could destroy Reeves and Castellanos. They'd found a sacred site that would legally prevent development. They'd survived the storm and made it to shelter. And someone had known exactly where they were. Someone had made sure they never came home to tell their story. 3 days later, Sarah received a call that changed everything. A man named Robert Hayes, former Coast Guard officer, had seen news coverage of her expedition and wanted to speak with her. His voice on the phone was hesitant, heavy with decades of guilt. They met at a quiet diner in Portsmouth. Hayes was in his 70s now, gray-haired and weathered, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime following orders and now regretted it. I was a communications officer in 1973, he began, stirring his coffee absently. 23 years old, following protocols, trusting the system. On December 6th, 3 weeks after the Marina Star was officially declared lost, I received a garbled radio transmission. Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. It came in at 2:17 a.m. during my night watch. Barely coherent through the static, but I caught fragments. Marina Star. Coordinates. Still alive. Need rescue. The call sign was correct, Dr. Mitchell. I verified it against our records. It was the Marina Star's official call sign. Why didn't anyone respond? Hayes's face crumpled with shame. I reported it immediately to my commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Patterson. He told me it was impossible. The Marina Star had been declared lost weeks ago. Said it was probably interference, hoaxers, maybe even smugglers using a fake call sign to lure rescue vessels. He told me to log it as unverified interference and forget about it. But you didn't forget. I couldn't. Something about that transmission. I kept a personal log, against regulations. I wrote down everything I could remember. The fragments of the transmission, the coordinates they were trying to give. And there was something else. Background noise, not just static. Voices, multiple voices. And what sounded like echoing. Like they were in a cave or tunnel. He pulled a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, pages yellowed with age. I've kept this for 50 years. I've read it so many times I have it memorized. The coordinates they were trying to transmit match the location of your cave system discovery. They were down there, Dr. Mitchell. They were alive in December trying to call for help. Sarah's eyes burned with tears. Why didn't you do more? I was 23 and terrified of losing my job. Patterson made it clear that if I pushed the issue, I'd be discharged for insubordination. I had student loans, a family who depended on me. I told myself that if they were really out there, someone else would hear them. Someone braver than me would respond. His voice broke. No one did. What happened to Patterson? Retired with full honors in 1985, moved to Florida, died in 2003. But before he retired, I saw something that's haunted me. I was filing reports in his office and found a letter. It was from Marcus Reeves Maritime Holdings, thanking Patterson for his assistance in maintaining navigational safety and mentioning a consulting position waiting for him after retirement. There was a check attached, $50,000. The room seemed to tilt. Patterson had been paid off. A Coast Guard commanding officer, sworn to save lives, had taken money to ignore a distress call. Did you ever try to come forward? Once, in 1984, I was drinking too much, feeling guilty. I went to a reporter at the Boston Globe, told him everything. He seemed interested, started investigating. Then 2 weeks later, he called me, said his editor killed the story. Not enough evidence. Too much time had passed, and I got a visit from a man in a nice suit who suggested I focus on my career and stop living in the past. Hayes pulled out another document, a photograph. I took this in December 1973, the night of the transmission. It's my log, showing the time, date, coordinates, and fragments of the message. I've never shown this to anyone except that reporter. But now, with everything you're discovering, maybe it's finally time people knew the truth. Sarah looked at the faded photograph of Hayes's handwritten log. Clear, detailed, dated. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed as memory or imagination. They called for help, she said quietly. Multiple times. And no one came. I didn't come, Hayes corrected, his voice thick with emotion. I chose my career over their lives. I've had to live with that choice every single day. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. You were a young man pressured by corrupt superiors. The guilt isn't yours alone, but it is mine, and I want to make it right. Whatever you need, testimony, evidence, my log, I'll give it. Even if it destroys my reputation, costs me my pension. Those men died because I was a coward. Their families deserve the truth. As Sarah drove back to her hotel, she felt the weight of the evidence accumulating. Recorded threats, false Coast Guard reports, paid-off officers, a conspiracy that had successfully hidden the truth for 50 years. But she still didn't know how it ended. Her father and his crew had survived through December, maybe longer. They'd called for help. They'd waited. What happened in those final days? How did 7 strong, resourceful men, safe in a shelter with supplies, end up dead? The answer, Sarah was beginning to realize, might be the most painful truth of all. Sarah's grandmother had died 2 years earlier, taking her secrets to the grave. Or so Sarah had thought. But that afternoon, going through boxes of documents from Maria Russo and other family members, Sarah realized she'd never fully searched her grandmother's belongings. Most had been distributed to relatives or donated, but Sarah had kept several boxes in storage, things she'd been too emotional to sort through at the time. She drove to the storage unit, her mind racing with all she'd learned. Inside, beneath Christmas decorations and old photographs, she found a small, locked box she'd never noticed before. The key was on her grandmother's keychain, which Sarah still carried. Inside were diaries. Not the bland daily planners Sarah had seen before, but deeper journals written in Portuguese, her grandmother's native language. Sarah had never been fluent, but she could read enough to understand. What she couldn't translate, she photographed and sent to a colleague who specialized in Portuguese translation. The entries began in November 1973. November 15th. No word from Thomas. The Coast Guard says the storm was too severe. They're searching, but haven't found anything. I know in my heart he's alive. My son is strong, like his father. He wouldn't leave us. November 30th. Still no word. They want to call off the search. I told them no. I'll pay for it myself if I have to. Sarah asks about her father every day. I don't know what to tell her. December 10th. Something strange happened today. A man came to the house, expensive suit, cold eyes. Said he was from an insurance company, needed to finalize Thomas's death certificate. But Thomas isn't dead. I refused to sign anything. He became angry, said I was making things difficult. When I asked him to leave, he said something that chilled me. Mrs. Mitchell, your son was involved in something he shouldn't have been. The best thing for everyone is to accept what happened and move on. I asked what he meant. He just smiled and left. Sarah's hands shook as she read. Her grandmother had been threatened. December 23rd. I hired a private investigator, Frank Morrison. He's former police, good reputation. I showed him the compass, the one Thomas had aboard the Marina Star. I never told anyone, but I recognized it in a photograph from his last voyage. I said it was a family heirloom to protect Sarah. But I know the truth. If Thomas had that compass with him, and it's here in our house, how did it get here? Who brought it? This was new information. Sarah had always believed the compass was a family heirloom, because that's what her grandmother had told everyone. But it had been aboard the ship. Someone had retrieved it and brought it to her grandmother, someone who had access to the Marina Star after it disappeared. Hirtuanthi, January 5, 1974. Frank found something. Records of communication between Coast Guard officers and Atlantic coastal fisheries. Money changing hands. He thinks the search was deliberately misdirected. He thinks Thomas and the others might have survived initially. He wants to investigate the cave areas along the coast, but it will be expensive and dangerous in winter weather. I told him to do whatever it takes. January 27th. Frank came to the house today looking shaken. He'd been diving near Point Mercy, following up on reports from the lighthouse keeper's daughter about signal lights. He found underwater caves, exactly where the lights had been seen. But when he tried to explore further, 2 boats appeared. Men in diving gear who weren't official rescue workers. They told him to leave, that he was trespassing in a restricted area. When he asked under whose authority, they just repeated, "Leave now or face consequences." Frank is scared. So am I. February 2. Frank quit. Said he couldn't continue the investigation. Someone had broken into his office and taken all his files on the Marina Star. The next day, his boat was vandalized. He told me he has a family to think about, and he's sorry. But this is too dangerous. He refunded my money and asked me never to contact him again. I don't blame him, but I can't let go. My son is out there. I feel it. February 15th. I tried to hire another investigator. No one will take the case. The first 3 I contacted knew about the Marina Star before I even explained. One told me honestly, "Ma'am, you're fighting people with more power and money than you can imagine. For your granddaughter's sake, let this go." But how can I? How can a mother give up on her son? February 28th, I received a phone call today. No one spoke. Just breathing, then the line went dead. It's happened 3 times this week. I know it's a message. Stop looking, or else. The entries stopped for several weeks. Then in March 18th, the compass. Someone left it on my doorstep wrapped in cloth. No note, just the compass Thomas had carried. I know what it means. It's proof that someone has been to the wreck. Someone has my son's belongings. But it's also a message. This is all you'll get. Stop looking, or Sarah will lose her grandmother too. I held that compass and cried for hours. Then I made a decision. I'll tell everyone it's a family heirloom. I'll let them think Thomas is gone. Because if I keep searching, someone will make sure Sarah grows up with no family at all. I choose her life over the truth. May God forgive me. Sarah was crying now, holding the diary against her chest. Her grandmother hadn't been in denial. She'd known the truth, or suspected enough of it, and had chosen silence to protect her granddaughter. The final translated entry was from years later, dated just months before her grandmother's death. Sarah is searching for her father now. She has the funding, the expertise, the determination I never had. I want to tell her everything, but I'm afraid. Afraid those men are still out there. Afraid of what she'll find, but I'm also proud. She's stronger than I was. Maybe she can finally bring Thomas home. Sarah closed the diary, understanding now the weight her grandmother had carried. The impossible choice between truth and safety. The daily grief of knowing her son might have survived initially, but choosing not to pursue it to keep her granddaughter safe. But now Sarah knew, and she wasn't going to stop. Not for Reeves, not for anyone. Her father had fought to bring the truth to light. Her grandmother had sacrificed everything to keep Sarah safe. Now it was Sarah's turn to finish what they'd started, no matter what it cost. Armed with new determination and mounting evidence, Sarah organized a comprehensive deep-dive expedition to fully map the cave system. She'd secured additional funding from a historical preservation society, carefully avoiding any more of Reeves's money, and brought in specialized equipment for extended underwater exploration. The team assembled on a cold morning in early August. Along with Jake and Elena, Sarah had recruited 2 experienced cave divers and a marine geologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, who specialized in underwater formations. As they descended toward the cave entrance, Sarah felt her father's presence more strongly than ever. This was where he'd sought shelter, where he'd waited for rescue, where he'd written that final letter saying he'd tried to come home. The cave entrance was partially obscured by rock formations and sea vegetation. It took nearly 20 minutes to clear enough space to enter safely. Inside, the beam of Sarah's dive light revealed a large chamber, roughly 40 feet across, with a natural air pocket at the top. The first thing she noticed was evidence of human presence. Modern equipment, or what had been modern 50 years ago, lay scattered on a natural shelf above the waterline. Waterproof containers, coiled rope, a battery-powered lantern, its power long since depleted. Tools arranged carefully, showing the methodical nature of men who'd been rationing supplies and maintaining hope. On the walls, carved into the soft stone, were names. 7 names: Richard Brennan, Thomas Mitchell, Anthony Russo, James O'Connor, Luis Mendes, David Hoffman, Michael Jang, the crew of the Marina Star. And beneath each name, a date, November 13th, 1973, the day they'd reached safety. Sarah's vision blurred inside her mask. Her father had been here. His hands had held these tools, carved his name into this wall. She reached out and traced the letters of his name, wishing she could somehow reach back through time and tell him, "I'm here. I found you. You're not forgotten." Jake signaled toward a narrow passage leading deeper into the cave system. The team followed, moving carefully through underwater tunnels and up into additional air chambers. Dr. Chen was taking samples, documenting the geological features, but Sarah's focus was on finding evidence of what had happened here. The second chamber was smaller but showed signs of longer-term occupation. More supplies, carefully organized. A makeshift calendar scratched into the wall tracking days. Sarah counted 63 marks. 2 months. They'd been here for 2 months, marking each day, maintaining hope. There were personal items, too. A photograph of a woman and child, Anthony Russo's fiancée, and her daughter from a previous relationship. A rosary, a harmonica, a child's drawing that must have been in someone's wallet. Small pieces of the lives they'd hoped to return to. But it was the third chamber that revealed the truth Sarah had been both seeking and dreading. This chamber was the deepest, accessed through a long underwater passage that required nearly 4 minutes of swimming. When they surfaced in the air pocket, Sarah's light fell on something that made her freeze, a more permanent shelter. The crew had modified this space, reinforcing sections with salvaged materials from the Marina Star, creating alcoves for sleeping, a central area for gathering. This wasn't temporary refuge. This was preparation for an extended stay. A makeshift communications setup sat in one corner. A marine radio partially disassembled, wires and components spread out as if someone had been trying to repair it. Tools lay nearby. They'd been working to fix the radio, to call for help. On a flat section of rock, Sarah found more writing. A journal, carved directly into the stone because paper hadn't survived the humidity. The entries were brief, carved with tremendous effort. December 1st. Still alive. 7 of us. Food running low, but we're rationing. Radio damaged beyond simple repair. We've been sending signal lights at night, hoping the lighthouse will see. December 15th. Saw boats above yesterday. Not rescue. They were searching the cave entrance. We stayed quiet. Captain says they're not here to help us. Sarah's blood ran cold. Someone had been searching for them. Not to rescue them, but to ensure they stayed hidden. December 25th. Christmas. We sang songs, shared memories. Luis made soup from our remaining supplies, somehow made it taste like a feast. We're hungry, cold, but still together. Still fighting. January 10th. Saw more boats. They're guarding the entrance now. We can't leave even if weather permits. Captain says we wait for them to leave. We have maybe 3 more weeks of food. January 20th. Getting weaker. David has a bad cough. We've been exploring deeper passages looking for another exit. Found one, but it's narrow, risky. February 2nd. The lighthouse keeper's daughter saw our signals. We know because Coast Guard boats appeared the next morning. But they didn't rescue us. They're posted outside the cave, watching, waiting. Someone wants us to die here. The final entry was dated February 14th, 1974. Out of food, out of options. Captain made a decision. There's a back passage that might lead to open water half a mile north. We'll try tonight. If we don't make it, let our families know we fought to come home. We loved them. We tried. Thomas Mitchell. Her father had written that last entry. His final words carved in stone. Dr. Chen called out from across the chamber. She was examining the far wall, where the narrow passage Thomas had mentioned led deeper into the rock. Sarah swam over, her heart pounding. The passage was barely wide enough for a person to fit through, winding, downward into darkness. As they followed it with their lights, the passage narrowed further, then stopped, collapsed. Tons of rock and debris completely blocking the way. Dr. Chen checked her equipment. Based on the sediment patterns and structural composition, this collapse happened during a seismic event. Looking at my records, she pulled out a waterproof tablet. There was a minor earthquake on February 18, 1974, magnitude 4.2, centered about 20 miles from here. Small enough not to cause major damage on land, but in these caves, it would have been devastating, Sarah finished. The timeline crystallized in her mind. Her father and the crew had been preparing to escape through this passage. But before they could, nature had sealed their fate. They'd been trapped. No food, no way out, boats guarding the main entrance. And then the tunnel had collapsed, taking their last hope with it. Jake found them in the collapsed section. 7 bodies, or what remained of them after 50 years in the cold, dark water. They'd been huddled together in the final chamber, having gone as far as they could before the passage became impassable. Together until the end. Sarah couldn't process it, couldn't breathe. This was her father. This was how he died. Not in the sudden violence of a storm, but in the slow, agonizing wait for death. Knowing rescue wouldn't come, that someone wanted them forgotten. On the wall above where they'd made their last stand, someone had carved one final message. We die here not because of nature, but because evil men chose our deaths over their exposure. Tell the truth. Make them pay. The crew of the Marina Star. Sarah surfaced hours later, devastated but determined. She had the evidence now. She had proof of how they'd died and, more importantly, proof of why. The carved journals, the blocked entrance, the timeline that proved they'd been deliberately left to die. Marcus Reeves and Victor Castellanos had murdered 7 men through calculated neglect. They'd paid off Coast Guard officers, blocked rescue attempts, and stationed boats to ensure the crew couldn't escape. It was time to bring them to justice. But first, Sarah had to figure out how to prove a 50-year-old conspiracy when both men had armies of lawyers and unlimited resources to bury the truth. Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone. The evidence was strong but legally complex. Maritime law, federal jurisdiction, archaeological site protection, civil versus criminal charges. She needed someone who understood both the legal framework and had the courage to take on powerful, wealthy men. Elena suggested Daniel Russo, the maritime lawyer who happened to be Anthony Russo's son. Sarah had met him briefly when his Aunt Maria had provided the tape recordings, but now she reached out formally, explaining everything she'd discovered. They met in his Boston office, a space filled with maritime charts and legal volumes. Daniel was in his 50s, with his father's same determined eyes that stared out from the photographs Sarah had seen. "I've spent my entire life wondering what really happened to my father," Daniel said, after Sarah finished explaining. "My mother died when I was young. My Aunt Maria raised me. She always said it wasn't an accident. But we had no proof. We have proof now." Sarah spread out everything on his conference table. The tape recordings, the Coast Guard logs, Hayes's testimony, the carved journals from the cave, photographs of the blocked tunnel, Dr. Chen's seismic report, her grandmother's diary. The evidence painted a clear picture of conspiracy, criminal negligence, and deliberate obstruction of rescue efforts. Daniel studied each piece carefully, his legal mind assessing the case from every angle. "This is strong," he finally said. "Incredibly strong. But we have significant obstacles. First, the statute of limitations. Most criminal charges expire after a certain number of years. We'd need to argue this as an ongoing conspiracy or cover-up that extends to the present day. Reeves is still actively suppressing the truth. He tried to control my expedition, claim salvage rights to prevent the real story from coming out. That helps. Second issue, proving direct causation. We can show Reeves and Castellanos threatened the crew, that Coast Guard officers were paid off, that rescue attempts were blocked. But proving they specifically intended the crew's deaths versus just trying to silence them, that's harder. The boat stationed outside the cave entrance, Hayes's ignored distress call, the deliberate misdirection of search efforts. Daniel nodded slowly. We could argue criminal negligence, depraved indifference, a knowing failure to rescue people in mortal danger. In maritime law, there's a duty to render aid. They violated that duty deliberately. And then there's the federal angle, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud, tampering with Coast Guard operations, violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act for trying to claim the sacred site. He picked up the photograph of the carved message. Tell the truth. Make them pay. This is your evidence and your father speaking across 50 years. We have a duty to honor that. I'll take the case, pro bono. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because my father deserves justice. Over the next weeks, Daniel built a comprehensive legal strategy. He filed civil suits against Reeves Maritime Holdings and the estate of Victor Castellanos, who had died in 2019, for wrongful death, emotional distress, and civil conspiracy. Simultaneously, he petitioned federal prosecutors to investigate potential criminal charges. The media attention was immediate and intense. Lost Cruise journals reveal 50-year conspiracy, read the Boston Globe headline. Maritime archaeologist discovers father died in corporate cover-up, declared the New York Times. Within days, the story went national, then international. Robert Hayes gave a tearful interview, taking full responsibility for his failure to pursue the distress call. I was 23 and scared of losing my job. 7 men died because I chose my career over their lives. I will carry that guilt to my grave, but I want to make sure the men who orchestrated this conspiracy are held accountable. Margaret Blackwood, the lighthouse keeper's daughter, appeared on camera for the first time, explaining how she'd seen the signals and been dismissed. They were down there for months, signaling for help, and no one listened. Not because the signals weren't seen, but because powerful men wanted those sailors forgotten. Maria Russo shared the tape recordings publicly. The sound of Victor Castellanos threatening Captain Brennan, "Accidents happen, boats sink, men disappear," became the defining evidence of premeditation. But Reeves fought back hard. His legal team issued statements calling the accusations baseless conspiracy theories and an emotionally driven attempt to assign blame for a tragic maritime accident. They argued that the cave discoveries, while interesting, didn't prove conspiracy, just that the crew had survived longer than initially believed before succumbing to natural causes. Dr. Mitchell is a grieving daughter trying to make sense of her father's death, Reeves's spokesman told reporters. We sympathize with her loss, but conflating tragedy with conspiracy serves no one. The real story is that brave fishermen fought for survival, and nature ultimately prevailed. It was a calculated response, designed to paint Sarah as emotional and irrational. And it might have worked, except for one thing: the financial records. Daniel's legal team, working with forensic accountants, traced money from Reeves Maritime Holdings to Lieutenant Commander Patterson's retirement account. They found consulting payments that had no corresponding work products. They uncovered shell companies that paid Coast Guard officers for maritime safety consulting during the exact period when the Marina Star's distress calls were being ignored. Most damning, they found payments to a salvage company in January 1974, with notes referencing containment operations at coordinates that matched the cave system's location. Reeves had paid people to guard the cave entrance, ensuring the crew couldn't escape. When this evidence became public, the narrative shifted. This wasn't a grieving daughter imagining conspiracies. This was documented, systematic murder through calculated negligence. The federal prosecutor's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into potential criminal charges. The Massachusetts Attorney General launched a separate inquiry into corporate conspiracy and obstruction of justice. And the families of the other crew members came forward, joining the civil suit. Suddenly, Reeves wasn't fighting one maritime archaeologist. He was fighting 7 families, multiple law firms, federal investigators, and public opinion. But the legal battles were just beginning, and Sarah knew that powerful men like Reeves didn't go down easily. They had resources, connections, and decades of experience burying inconvenient truths. The question was, would justice finally prevail, or would the crew of the Marina Star remain victims of a system that protected wealth over truth? 3 months into the legal proceedings, something unexpected happened. Michael Jang's widow, now 92 and living in a nursing home, received a visitor. A man in his 70s, well-dressed but looking haggard, who introduced himself as David Castellanos, Victor's younger brother. Mrs. Jang called Daniel Russo immediately. "This man wants to talk about what happened to our husbands. He says he has information. He says he's been living with guilt for 50 years. Daniel, Sarah, and Elena arrived within hours. David Castellanos sat in the nursing home's visiting room, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. When Sarah entered, he looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "You look like your father," he said quietly. "You have his determination, his refusal to quit." "You knew my father?" "I saw him once. November 1973. I was working at Atlantic Coastal Fisheries, my brother Victor's company. I was supposed to be learning the business, being groomed to take over eventually. Instead, I learned what kind of man my brother really was." Over the next 2 hours, David Castellanos told a story that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions and revealed details even more horrifying than she'd imagined. Victor and Marcus Reeves had been planning the coastal development for years. The independent fishermen were obstacles. Their presence and federal fishing rights prevented the large-scale commercial operations Reeves wanted to build. The plan was to systematically drive them out through intimidation, but Captain Brennan had been too stubborn, too well-respected in the community. When the captain found that indigenous sacred site, David explained, it should have been his victory. Federal law would have protected the area, stopped the development. But Victor saw it differently. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to eliminate the problem permanently. "The storm," Sarah said, her voice hollow. Yes, Victor had contacts in the weather service. He knew the nor'easter was coming days in advance. Severe enough to provide cover, but not so severe that it would ground all vessels. He arranged for Atlantic coastal boats to be in the area, monitoring the Marina Star's position. David's hands shook as he continued. When the storm hit and the Marina Star went silent, Victor's people tracked them. They knew about the caves. Indigenous fishing communities had used them for centuries, and Victor had access to historical surveys. When the crew took shelter there, Victor made a decision. Let nature take its course, but ensure they couldn't escape. He stationed boats outside the entrance. For months, rotating shifts, always someone watching. The official story was that they were conducting salvage operations, looking for debris. But really, they were making sure no one left that cave alive. When the lighthouse keeper's daughter reported seeing signals, Victor paid Patterson to ignore them. When the Coast Guard received the distress call, Victor paid to have it suppressed. Sarah felt sick. They were deliberately starved to death. Victor called it containment. He convinced himself he wasn't killing them, just letting nature run its course. But I knew it was murder. I saw the payment records, heard the phone calls, watched my brother orchestrate everything, and I did nothing. I was 25 years old, terrified of my brother, financially dependent on him. So I stayed silent while 7 men died. Why come forward now? David looked at her with devastated eyes. Because I'm dying. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less. I've spent 50 years trying to justify my silence, trying to convince myself I had no choice. But I did have a choice, and I chose wrong. I don't want to die with this secret. I want your father and his crew to have justice, even if I don't deserve forgiveness. He pulled out a folder filled with documents, internal memos from Atlantic Coastal Fisheries, payment receipts, handwritten notes from Victor detailing the containment operation, even photographs of the boats stationed outside the cave entrance. This is everything I kept. Insurance, in case Victor ever turned on me. Proof of what he did, what Reeves helped facilitate. I'll testify. I'll give a deposition, whatever you need. Daniel's face was grim as he reviewed the documents. This is more than enough for criminal charges. With your testimony, we can prove first-degree murder through depraved indifference. But Victor is dead, Sarah said. He died in 2019. But Reeves is alive, Daniel countered. And these documents show he was an active participant in the conspiracy. He funded the operation, benefited from it financially, and helped cover it up for 50 years. David's testimony can bring him down. Over the next weeks, David Castellanos gave extensive depositions. His testimony was devastating. Detailed accounts of conversations with his brother, financial records showing Reeves's payments, timelines that matched every piece of evidence Sarah had gathered. The federal prosecutor announced criminal charges against Marcus Reeves, 7 counts of criminally negligent homicide, conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery of federal officials, and violation of federal maritime rescue statutes. Each count carried a potential sentence of decades in prison. Reeves's empire began to crumble. Business partners distanced themselves. Investors pulled out. Properties were seized for investigation. The man who had built a fortune on the graves of 7 fishermen watched it all fall apart in a matter of weeks. But Reeves had one more card to play. His lawyers announced he was willing to make a deal. Full testimony about the conspiracy, additional evidence about other corrupt maritime practices, and financial restitution to the victims' families. In exchange, he wanted reduced charges and the possibility of parole. The prosecutor brought the offer to the victims' families. It was Sarah's decision to make as the lead plaintiff. Accept the deal and guarantee Reeves would spend time in prison, but potentially walk free in his 70s, or reject it and risk a trial that could take years and might not result in conviction. Sarah sat alone in the hotel room where this had all begun. The carved compass, her father's compass, in her hands. What would he want? Justice, certainly, but also truth. Full, complete truth that could never be buried again. She called Daniel. Accept the deal, but with conditions. He testifies publicly. Everything goes on record. No sealed documents, no confidential settlements. The full story gets told. He might refuse. Then we go to trial. But I think he'll accept. Because the one thing men like Reeves fear more than prison is having their legacy destroyed. Let him serve his time, but let him do it knowing the whole world knows what he is. A man who murdered 7 people to protect his profit margin. The deal was struck. Marcus Reeves would plead guilty to reduced charges, serve a minimum of 15 years, and provide full testimony about the conspiracy. Justice, imperfect but real, was finally coming for the crew of the Marina Star. The trial proceedings became a media sensation. Court TV broadcast every day of testimony. Documentaries were fast-tracked into production. The story of the Marina Star crew captured public imagination. Brave working-class fishermen standing up to corporate greed, only to be systematically murdered through calculated neglect. Marcus Reeves's testimony was the centerpiece. Over 5 days, he detailed the conspiracy with cold precision, showing no remorse, only the detached efficiency of a businessman explaining a failed venture. Yes, he and Victor Castellanos had planned to drive out independent fishermen. Yes, they'd known about the storm and saw it as an opportunity. Yes, he'd approved funding for the containment operation. He still used that euphemism, unable or unwilling to call it what it was, a death sentence. The crew of the Marina Star had evidence that could have destroyed our development plans, Reeves testified in his measured, unemotional voice. The sacred site discovery, combined with their documentation of our intimidation tactics, would have resulted in federal investigations, canceled permits, and criminal charges. Eliminating that threat seemed necessary at the time. Eliminating the threat, the prosecutor repeated. You mean killing 7 men? I mean ensuring they couldn't interfere with our operations. By starving them to death in a cave, while your boats prevented their escape. Reeves paused. Yes, the courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Reeves had just confessed to premeditated murder, albeit in the corporate doublespeak that had allowed him to justify it for 50 years. David Castellanos' testimony was more emotional. He broke down multiple times, detailing his brother's coldness, the casual way Victor had spoken about letting nature take its course, the payments to corrupt officials. My brother used to say that business was war, and in war, casualties were inevitable, David testified. But these weren't casualties. They were murders, calculated, deliberate murders of innocent men whose only crime was standing in the way of profit. Robert Hayes's testimony brought tears to the courtroom. Now 75 and in poor health, he described the night he received the distress call, his commanding officer's dismissal, the 50 years of guilt he'd carried. I heard their voices on that radio, Hayes said, his voice breaking. Real men, desperate men, begging for rescue, and I followed orders to ignore them. I chose my career over their lives. I'm as guilty as anyone in this courtroom. But the most powerful testimony came from Sarah herself. She told the story of her father, not as an abstract victim, but as a real man. A father who taught her to tie sailing knots, who smelled like salt water and coffee, who sang old Portuguese songs while cooking dinner. She described growing up without him, the questions that haunted her childhood, her grandmother's secret grief. She showed the carved compass, explained its journey from ship to grandmother's doorstep to museum evidence, and she read from the stone journal, her father's final words carved into rock 50 feet underwater. Let our families know we fought to come home. We loved them. We tried. My father didn't die in a storm, Sarah told the jury. He survived the storm. He found shelter. He rationed food. He sent distress signals. He waited for rescue. He did everything a skilled, determined sailor could do to survive and return to his daughter. And he died anyway, because 2 men valued money over human life. She pointed at Reeves. That man stole 50 years from me. 50 years of memories I should have had with my father. Birthday parties he should have attended. Graduations he should have celebrated. Grandchildren he should have met. All of it gone, not because of an unavoidable tragedy, but because of conscious, deliberate choices by men who thought profit was more important than human life. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Marcus Reeves guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 15. Given Reeves's age, 73, it was effectively a life sentence. Mr. Reeves, the judge said, you have shown a callous disregard for human life that is almost incomprehensible to this court. 7 men died not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, over the course of months, knowing that rescue wasn't coming, that they'd been abandoned. The psychological torture alone is beyond measure, and you orchestrated all of it for financial gain. This court finds your actions reprehensible and deserving of the maximum sentence allowed by law. The civil settlements came next. The Castellanos estate paid out $250 million to the victims' families. Reeves's personal assets were seized and distributed as restitution. The various companies involved in the conspiracy faced federal fines and were required to fund maritime safety programs. But money wasn't what mattered to Sarah. What mattered was that the truth was now public, undeniable, permanent. Her father's story would be taught in maritime law classes, discussed in ethics courses, remembered in history books. The crew of the Marina Star had fought to expose corruption and protect a sacred site. They'd lost that battle in 1973, but 50 years later, they'd won the war. However, Sarah's work wasn't finished. There was one more thing she needed to do. One final act to honor her father and his crew. It was a clear October morning, almost exactly 52 years after the Marina Star disappeared, when Sarah stood on the deck of a research vessel at the coordinates where the cave system lay below. The water was calm, reflecting autumn sunlight like scattered diamonds. Around her gathered the families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of the crew. Maria Russo, now 89 and in a wheelchair, held a photograph of her brother. Daniel Russo stood beside his aunt, one hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Jang, incredibly, had made the trip, bundled in blankets and supported by her children. David Castellanos was there too, frail from cancer, but insistent on attending. "Chattuihond, I owe them this," he'd said. "It's the least I can do." The media was notably absent. Sarah had requested privacy for this ceremony, and the families had agreed. This moment was for them, not for public consumption. Sarah had spent the last months working with tribal leaders from the Wabanaki Confederation, the National Park Service, and maritime archaeologists to establish the site as a protected memorial. The cave system would be preserved as both a sacred indigenous site and a monument to the 7 men who died there. "We're here today," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the quiet water, "to honor 7 men who stood up for what was right and paid the ultimate price. They were fathers, sons, brothers. They were fishermen, but they were also protectors of the ocean, of history, of truth." She spoke about each man individually, sharing stories the families had told her. Captain Richard Brennan, who'd taught his daughter to navigate by the stars. Anthony Russo, who'd been planning to propose to his girlfriend on Christmas. James O'Connor, whose laugh could be heard across the docks. Luis Mendez, who made the best fish stew in New England. David Hoffman, who played harmonica and dreamed of opening a music shop. Michael Jang, who sent money home to his parents in China every month. And Thomas Mitchell, her father, who'd promised his 6-year-old daughter he'd always come home. "They didn't get to come home," Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But they're not lost anymore. We found them. We told their story. We brought them justice. And now, we honor them." One by one, family members came forward to cast flowers into the water above the cave. White roses, her father's favorite. As the flowers drifted on the gentle waves, Sarah read the final inscription that would be placed on the memorial plaque. "Here lie 7 men who chose honor over profit, truth over silence, and courage over fear. They survived a storm only to be left to die by those who valued money over human life. May their story serve as an eternal reminder that justice, though delayed, can never be denied. May the ocean that claimed them also remember them. May we never forget." Elena began singing a traditional Portuguese song of mourning, something Sarah's grandmother used to hum. Other voices joined, different languages, different traditions, united in grief and remembrance. Sarah scattered her grandmother's ashes along with the flowers, finally fulfilling the promise she'd made 2 years ago. Her grandmother could rest now, knowing her son's story had been told, his name cleared, his sacrifice honored. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah's granddaughter, 16-year-old Emma, who'd spent the summer learning to dive, approached the railing. "Grandma, will you take me down there someday? To see where Great-Grandpa Thomas was? To see what he saw?" Sarah put her arm around Emma's shoulders. "When you're ready, when you've trained enough and understand the responsibility. Because it's not just a dive site, Emma. It's a sacred place. A place where men fought to survive, where they loved their families even in their darkest hours, where they chose to do the right thing even though it cost them everything. I want to be brave like that, like Great-Grandpa." "You already are," Sarah said, pulling her granddaughter close. "You come from a line of brave people. Your great-grandmother, who chose your safety over her need for answers. Your great-grandfather, who stood up to powerful men. And me. Well, I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to let the truth die, no matter how many people want it buried." As the boat began its journey back to shore, Sarah stood at the stern, watching the coordinates grow distant. Below those waters lay her father, finally at peace. The cave system had been sealed to protect it, preserved as a memorial that would last for generations. The carved compass sat in a maritime museum now, the centerpiece of an extensive exhibit about the Marina Star. The journals, the photographs, the evidence of conspiracy, all preserved, all accessible, all telling the story of 7 men who'd refused to be silenced. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a 6-year-old girl waiting for a father who never came home, to a woman who'd spent her life diving into the ocean's depths, to the maritime archaeologist who'd finally uncovered the truth. She'd learned that the ocean keeps secrets, but it also surrenders them to those patient enough to search. That corruption can be powerful, but truth is more powerful still. That justice delayed is not justice denied, only justice waiting for someone brave enough to demand it. And she'd learned that love, a father's love for his daughter, a grandmother's love for her granddaughter, a family's love for the truth, love can survive even 50 years of silence and grief. As the shore came into view, Sarah made a silent promise to her father, to his crew, to all those lost at sea whose stories remain untold. "I will keep diving. I will keep searching. I will keep telling the truth. Because some stories are too important to remain buried in the depths." If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. The Marina Star's crew fought for truth in 1973, and their story reminds us that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way to light. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of maritime history's most heartbreaking conspiracies. Until next time, remember, the ocean keeps its secrets, but it also tells its stories to those willing to listen.